everybody, it's Miss Burnett. I'm going to be reading you Chapter 1 of Farm Rescue by Darrel and Sally Odgers today, and then later in the week I'll read Chapter 2. So Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called Rain. Bah, bah, bad. Sheep in a panic make a powerful lot of noise. Can we take the boat to rescue them? James shouted. He had to shout over the noise of the rain, the sheep, and the river. Stamp and your dog work well together. They can help by keeping the sheep in a bunch. Too risky, yelled Glen Pepper. Rain dripped off his long nose. Look at that! He pointed as a whole tree tore past us on the flood. If that hit the boat, we'd tip over. Rusty, the old border collie, barked once sharply. Then he growled, Do something, quick, to Glen. Glen stared at the sheep and shook his head. Rain poured down. It was like having a big bucket of water tipped over us. Why are some humans so slow? Said Rusty. Those sheep need help. Wait a bit, I said. I never finished what I was about to say. 1 minute Rusty stood right there beside me, his ears and eyebrows steaming with water. The next, he leapt out into the river and disappeared. So why were James and I standing in the rain with a long-nosed man and an old dog staring at a stranded sheep? It started one afternoon as we drove the Forby along the coast on our way to Cow Fork. We'd been having a wonderful time camping along the way. James and I both loved to run, so we often stopped in interesting places and raced one another up hills and down twisty, turny tracks. If we met other people and dogs, we'd stop to have what Dad Barnaby called a yarn. Things were perfect until the weather changed. By now, drizzle had been falling for 3 days. The floor of the Forby was muddy. The windows were fogging up. James' hair was damp. The Forby smelled of wet dog. That was me, of course. James and I were fed up. We wished we were back at the Barnaby station. It's going to be another cold night, Stamp, James said. The tent's still wet from last night. I gave a small whine of agreement. Like most border collies, I understand a lot of human words, although of Paul's I can't say them. I thumped my tail. I knew we'd work something out. We always do. I leaned against James' shoulder, wetting his shirt. That settles it, said James, nudging me off. We're going to find a dry place to sleep tonight. The drizzle chose that moment to turn into heavy rain. James switched the windshield wipers on as high as they would go. Rivers of water swished off and ran down the windows. After a bit, James pulled the Forby over to the side of the road and unfolded the map. Okay, he said. We're several hours from Cow Fork, but quite close to Glen and Wendy Pepper's place at Pepper's Plains. What do you think, Stamp? I pawed at the map. Pepper's Plains it is, said James. We set off. As James drove along, I looked out the window. Even over the Forby's engine and the rain on the roof, I could hear a roaring sound. A train? I perked my ears. I guess that's the Genadiah River, said James. It sounded a lot bigger than it looks on the map. Ah, here we are. There's the sign for Pepper's Plains. He turned the vehicle onto a gravel road. Well, it was probably gravel, but at the moment, it was more like mud. It was still pouring when we reached the homestead at Pepper's Plains farm. James parked the Forby and we dashed for the doorstep. I got there first. James runs fast, but I run faster. By the time James caught up, I had shaken the rain off my fur and was sitting on the doorstep. Show off, said James. He tapped the door knocker. The woman who answered the door was about as old as Mum Barnaby. She smelled of vegetable soup. She looked a bit surprised to see a wet young man and a wet but handsome border collie on her doorstep. James smiled. Hello, Mrs. Pepper. Remember me? The woman stared at us for a moment. James Barnaby, what in the world are you doing here? Are your parents with you? No, it's just us, Mrs. P. We're on a bit of a camping trip, said James. In this weather? Said Mrs. Pepper. Why do people insist on camping in the rain? It wasn't raining when we left home, said James. A few minutes later, we were sitting in the front of the fire, James' shirt and my coat steaming gently. The whole room smelled of vegetable soup and wet dog. Mrs. Pepper gave James a towel. "That's a handsome dog," she said as James started to rub me dry. I gave Mrs. Pepper a stamp of approval. "This is Stamp," said James. "I chose him from Penny Black's last litter. Dad says I picked myself a champion." "When he's dry, you can shut him in the barn," said Mrs. Pepper. The barn? Maybe she didn't deserve my stamp of approval. Alright guys, that's chapter 1. I do want to show you in the back of the, behind chapter 1 after it's finished, it has Stamp's glossary, so I'll go over the definitions for some of those words you might not know. So the first one is Barnaby Station, and this is a big farm where I was born and where my mother, Penny Black, still lives. James' parents, Mom and Dad Barnaby, live there too. Champion. A champion dog is one who is clever, well-behaved, skilled, handsome, and likely to win lots of prizes, just like me. Having a yarn. This means talking and getting to know someone. Friendly humans do it. Perfect means perfect for dogs. Pawful means awful for dogs. The smell of wet dog. This has nothing to do with being dirty. It's all about being a dog and being wet. And finally, Stamp of Approval. And this is an award for being clever, kind, and all around fine. Only I can give this award. Alright, so probably Wednesday or Thursday I'll be back on and read chapter 2 of the book. So I hope you guys have a good week of learning and being safe inside with your families, and I will see you another day this week. Bye guys, have a good week.